Well, now, how did it work in the Gilded Age? I guess the Morgan era between Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt. It was basically J.P. Morgan acting as the central banker, but he could only do so much, that kind of thing?
Well, it was a so-called national banking system, and there were certain favored national banks that were in cahoots with the government, a shocking situation, I'm sure you'll know, who were could issue notes. But there was no central bank. And when there was a crisis caused by too much note issue, Morgan organized all the other bankers in New York to fix it. And indeed, they did fix it. And their commerce returned and everything was fine. On the other hand, unfortunately, J.P. Morgan decided from this that he shouldn't have to do that again, and that the government should do it, and that we needed a central bank. And so J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, the Kuhn-Loeb interests, and so forth, all got together and organized a propaganda campaign for a central bank, which America hadn't had in a very long time.
Well, and one of my favorite parts of that propaganda campaign, and this is, of course, the Fed itself is the creature from Jekyll Island, the little island off the coast of Georgia that I guess was Morgan's little private island where they met and wrote this thing up, was that they actually opposed it. Nelson Aldrich, I guess they had originally introduced it in the Senate, and everybody knew Nelson Aldrich's daughter had just married John Rockefeller Jr. and that kind of thing. So it was kind of dead on arrival there. And so they had some Democrats introduce it in the House, and all the Republicans and Morgan and Rockefeller type interests went around giving speeches to the chambers of commerce across the country and so forth, saying, it's Bolshevism, it must be stopped. And so the whole country thought, well, if Rockefeller and Morgan are against it, we're pretty sure this is a good idea. Let's break the grip of the money trust by passing this Federal Reserve Act.
Well, it's pretty much the case. I mean, what they actually did was, part of the propaganda was that there'd be no more business cycles. Part of it was that there'd be no more inflation, and that there would be a flexible currency, so that when more money was needed in terms of the farming cycle and that sort of thing, there'd be more, but not too much. But the key thing about the Federal Reserve was it would break power of the big bankers. They would never be able to harm the American people again. But, of course, it was the big bankers who had actually written the legislation. And, by the way, I highly recommend a visit to Jekyll Island, Georgia. It's a pretty little island right off the Georgia coast. It's a park now, and you can go to the former J.P. Morgan Club, which is a hotel, and you can visit all the so-called cottages, actually beautiful mansions of the Rockefellers and all the various other people who were associated with Morgan. So, and you can actually go in the room where the Federal Reserve Act was drafted. So it's a very neat thing to visit. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, actually, last time I was in Atlanta, I was looking at the map and thinking, gee, I think that's a little too far, but maybe someday.
Well, the Mises Institute has held 2 anti-Fed conferences at Jekyll Island.
Really?
Yeah, and maybe we'll do another one, get you to come down to that.
That's funny. All right, so this thing was basically signed into law at the end of 1913. The war broke out in Europe, I guess just a few months later, and then by 1917, America was in the war. Now, what's the relationship between the Federal Reserve Bank and America's war effort and the Wilson administration?
Well, Scott, as you know, to me the conundrum is, do they fight wars to inflate, or do they inflate to fight wars?
Yeah, a little bit of both, maybe.
But I think it's both. And, of course, I'm sure by the merest happenstance that the J.P. Morgan crowd, which was entirely in cahoots with similar interests in England and with the English government, then you had them the horrific disaster of World War I, probably the worst disaster in the history of Western civilization, especially because it's part 2 of it was World War II. They really are just 2 parts of the same war. And so having a central bank, of course, Woodrow Wilson, by the way, it's just not the Democrats. William Howard Taft, the Republican president, had also supported, of course, the establishment of the central bank. So they turned up the printing presses, and there was a vast artificial boom. This is the way they funded all the war spending. But as with any of these artificial booms, they're always followed by a bust. Thank goodness the bust came during the administration of the heroic Warren G. Harding, one of my favorite presidents. And Harding, who was too busy playing poker and drinking and having a good time, didn't do anything about it. And as a result, the depression, and it was a depression of 1920 and 21 and so forth, was very short and very sharp. So everything was liquidated.
Ron Paul brought that one up on Fox News just yesterday. He said, yeah, there was a crash right after the war, but we don't even remember it because it was over quickly because nobody did anything. And then they did the exact same thing again, created a whole brand new bubble. We know it as the Roaring Twenties.
Well, that's right. But Harding, and by the way, just to mention that since I was talking about all the bad stuff about Andrew Jackson, let me just mention two good things about poor Warren G. Harding, who is so besmirched by all the presidential historians.
Sure.
He immediately released Eugene Debs from prison. Debs had been imprisoned by the monster Woodrow Wilson for saying in a speech that young Americans should not be used as cannon fodder for the war in Europe, and that the conscription bill was unconstitutional and a moral disaster and so forth. He was put in jail. His health was destroyed. He was particularly treated badly as a political prisoner. And Wilson always refused to release him even after the war. But Warren G. Harding did release him. Harding, too, pulled the American troops out of Haiti. America, always an imperial power, of course, was occupying Haiti at that point. He pulled the troops out. So Harding, I kind of like Warren G. Harding.
By the way, Deb's speech that got him thrown in prison can be found if you just click More Viewpoints. They're about in the middle of the page at antiwar.com.
Okay, I'm just going to tell one quick story about Wilson. John V. Denson.
I love Wilson bashing.
John V. Denson, an editor of two great books, one called The Cost of War and the other An Attack on the American Presidency, and also take a look at his archive on LewRockwell.com, Denson. He had a relative who was at a man called Wild Bill Denson, who was at a dinner party in Birmingham, Alabama, and denounced the idea of conscription and criticized Wilson. And this is at a dinner party. He's arrested for subversion, for comments made at a dinner party, arrested, tried, and convicted. Was going to be sent to prison. Thank goodness the thing was overturned, because it turned out that the particular law that made criticism of Wilson and his greatness illegal had not been signed into law when he made these remarks. So he didn't have to go to prison. But that was the sort of atmosphere, the totalitarian atmosphere under the monster dictator Woodrow Wilson, who was also, by the way, the great inspiration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was Wilson's assistant secretary of the Navy.
Yeah, I think that's great that they let him off on the ex post facto, but not on the First Amendment or property rights or anything like that.
The First Amendment had no relevance at all.
And in fact, let me just add there real quickly that on LewRockwell.com, your website, the brilliant Joseph Stromberg has an article called Remembering with Astonishment Woodrow Wilson's Reign of Terror in Defense of Freedom, all about the war on domestic dissent during the Wilson years, and it's just a great article, the best.
Well, you even had, for example, German teachers lynched. I mean, it was a very, very bad period when people of German descent were forced to change their names, and you had the Boston Symphony Orchestra refusing to play any music by German composers, anything by Beethoven or Bach. I mean, the whole, the hysteria that we associate, say, with the period right after 9/11 is not new. This sort of war hysteria has taken place before in American history.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, Roaring Twenties, inflationary bubble, the Great Depression, and why it lasted so long.
Well, all during the 1920s, there was vast increase in the money supply. It did not raise the general price level, quote-unquote, the price level, but it kept it stable, which is a very bad sign, because in a free market economy, especially a far freer market economy in the 1920s than now, prices should be gently falling, because as there's more and more goods and services being produced and the money supply is not going up, money becomes worth more, prices fall. But you did have booms in the stock market, booms in Florida land, and other areas of the economy, and it all came to an end in 1929.